Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Colloquium. It's a great pleasure to welcome Emeritus Professor Richard Booth today, who will be discussing, as you can see, Confronting Climate Change, Lessons from the Adirondacks. An Emeritus Professor in CRP, which he joined 48 years ago in 1977, and only retired a few years ago after 45 years of teaching here. But even before Professor Booth joined us, he had served as a senior attorney with the New York State Adirondack Park Agency and a lawyer with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So Professor Booth, right from the start, has mixed his responsibilities as a professor with substantial periods of public service. From November 2007 through June 2016, he served as a member of the New York State Adirondack Park Agency, pursuant to appointments by 3 governors. Prior to that, Booth was elected to 2 four-year terms on the Tompkins County Legislature. Thanks to an appointment by a 4th governor, Booth served from 1991 to 1995 as a member of the New York State Low-Level Radioactive Waste Siting Commission. Maybe he'll share where that got cited with us. In addition, he was elected 3 times to the City of Ithaca's Common Council. His 10 years of service on the council included 6 years as chair of the city's Budget and Administration Committee. When it comes to the subject of today's talk, Booth is not only a scholar, but has himself become a source for others learning about and studying the Adirondack Park Agency. And for me, and I think you will find this true, as someone whose office was next to a classroom in which Professor Booth lectured, I can tell you that his great gift is making the law come alive and helping us understand just how important it is to everything we do as planners. So with that, please welcome Professor Richard Booth.
Jeff, thank you. That was at least kind and probably over the top. Confronting climate change, lessons from the Adirondacks. A disclaimer at the beginning. Lots of the climate change issues obviously are tied to the use of energy. I'm not talking about the use of energy today. I'm talking about the use of land and managing land resources, which, as we will see, is certainly tied to the climate change crisis. For years, numerous experts have informed us of the multiple connections between wisely using land and reducing the impacts of climate change. This statement from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency 2009 is only one of many similar statements by similarly knowledgeable experts. Climate change and land use change are global drivers of environmental change. Impact assessments frequently show that interactions between climate and land use changes can create serious challenges for aquatic ecosystems, water quality, and air quality. While land use can exacerbate climate impacts, land use planning, policy, and management can also create important adaptation opportunities to increase the resilience of sensitive socioeconomic or ecological systems. In other words, if we use land wisely, we can help reduce harmful emissions that escape to the atmosphere and are driving the climate change crisis. And by protecting vegetation in many places, we can help sequester some portion of those emissions. In addition, if we use land wisely, we can ameliorate some of climate change's impacts on our communities. Much of the discussion about the connections between land use and climate change focus on local government decision-making. To some degree, that makes sense. In the United States, most regulatory decisions, that is, regulating what private individuals may do with their property, most regulatory land use decisions are made by local governments. Today's major theme runs contrary to much of that discussion. What we're focusing today is on the need to pay far greater attention to state-level land use decision-making dealing with large regions, that is, regions that are far larger than individual local governments. Our focus today, then, is on 50 years plus of experience in New York State in managing land resources across a very large region. Now, you might well ask, and knowledgeably ask, if most land use decisions in the United States are made at the local government level, why is Booth spending time focusing on land use decision-making at the state level? All right, and I think the answer is clear, and at least in my mind, it's compelling. It's obviously not compelling in the views of many other people. If we're honest and we're practical, we will recognize that controlling land and land resources on a scale large enough to deal with the threats of climate change cannot realistically be accomplished local government by local government. There are far too many decision makers, that is, there are far too many local governments. Their decisions often conflict with each other and are likely to conflict with each other, and local governments are likely to take far too long to make decisions which collectively will have a significant impact on the management of resources. This slide deals with the realities of land use management in New York State, and you can think about this in the context of 50 states across the United States. In New York State alone, there are more than 2,100 local jurisdictions that have land use authority. They are cities, towns, and villages. Towns are the biggest number in that 2,100 plus. But so in order to affect land use decision-making, you've got to get at least many of them to make reasonably responsible decisions. To a very large degree, under state law, those 2,100 plus local jurisdictions may decide what land use controls to adopt without regard to what their neighboring local governments are doing. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but the exceptions are not major. Each local government basically gets to choose on its own what it will do. And finally, those 2,100 New York State local jurisdictions may decide not to adopt any land use controls. Here we are in 2025. There are a number of local jurisdictions in Tompkins County. We're in Tompkins County. A number of jurisdictions here that don't have land use controls. So again, there's a need to focus on land use decision-making at a larger level. We're going to focus on the Adirondack Park. You're going to see that map. It's been superimposed. This is a NASA satellite image. I think it's a NASA satellite. Anyway, it's a satellite image from several hundred miles in space. To get you located, there's the Adirondack Park. Montreal's there. New York City's here. You see Cape Cod. You see Long Island, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, the Hudson River, and up here, the Hudson Bay. So you're looking at a big section of North America. And on that enormous scale, the Adirondack Park is very, very visible. It is a park that covers 9,000 square miles. That's almost the size, that's about the size of Vermont and about the size of New Hampshire. Those are two states. This park is as big as either one of those two states. A fact that all planners should keep readily in mind: a square mile in any configuration, circular, triangular, elongated, a square mile equals 640 acres. All right, so the 9,000 square miles is a park of 6 million acres. Here you see the outline of the Adirondack Park superimposed on a map of New York State. Covers about 20% of the state. I won't answer this question, but it's obviously the map that divides the state of New York into regions. I won't tell you what those regions are, but maybe later somebody will tell us what those are. If you're interested in regional planning, New York State reflects those regions, but they don't look like anything you've probably thought about. As I said, it covers about 20% of New York State. It is by far the largest park in the lower 48. There are some national parks in Alaska that are larger than the Adirondack Park, but a still 6-million-acre park is considerably bigger, for example, than Yellowstone, Death Valley National Park, the Everglades National Park down in Florida. It's an area of exceptional resources. One would expect that. An area so big and it's been protected for a long time. Lots of mountains, huge forest lands, 3,000, or not exactly obviously, roughly 3,000 lakes and ponds, some 30,000 miles of rivers and streams, thousands upon thousands of acres of freshwater wetlands, habitat for a great many plant and animal species. But the Adirondack Park is a very different kind of park than the national parks that you see. Because in the national parks, the United States government owns either 100% or occasionally there are small inholdings. For example, in Yosemite National Park, I've actually been to a place inside the park that's privately owned. But when you see a national park, it's essentially federally owned. The Adirondack Park, on the other hand, the state of New York owns just a little bit less than half of it. The other half is almost all owned by private landowners. The state land parcels, some of them are quite small, some of them are huge. The private land parcels, many of them are small. For example, small house lots or small farms, and some of the private ownerships are enormous. And so private owners own a substantial amount of the park. Local governments own a very small amount of acreage in the Adirondacks. In the Adirondack vernacular, when we talk about land issues, we talk about state land issues and private land issues, and everybody understands that the term private land in the Adirondacks means privately owned land, and those lands owned by individual local governments. And then the state government owns the other nearly 50%. There are about 100 local governments that are wholly or partly in the Adirondacks, going back to my point about making land use decisions, about 100 local governments. There's a permanent population, and there's no big permanent population in any of the national parks you see here. Permanent population of 120 to 130,000. That's the population in the summer is obviously much larger than that as people come into the park during the summer. Several images that give you a sense of the Adirondack landscape. This is fairly typical, a small community. You see some development probably along a state highway. You see that the land is heavily forested. The land is obviously rugged. The hamlets are like you'd find communities most anywhere in New York State or other states. Essex is a particularly beautiful small hamlet over in the eastern part of the park. You find all the institutions that one would expect to find in a community. Lots of residences, multiple family homes, single family homes, fire departments, police stations. There are a number of prisons that the state has in the Adirondacks, religious institutions, businesses, industry, et cetera. This is a shot in Saranac Lake, which is one of the larger hamlets in the park. Many of the park's communities have industrial histories because water power was obviously available with so much water flowing across a rough landscape. And then this gives you an idea of development outside the park. Again, you can see it's a quite rugged terrain. This is along a development near a lake. The economy of the Adirondacks is almost always fragile. Today, tourism is the big industry. but tourism isn't necessarily a seasonal industry. Some of the Adirondack communities have year-round tourist activity, Lake Placid, for example, Old Forge, but most of the Adirondack communities abide by the very historic Adirondack guideline. Economically, you make it between Memorial Day and Labor Day, or you don't make it, all right? Unemployment is high, particularly in the winter. Rural poverty is a very real problem in upstate New York, and that's certainly true in the Adirondacks. Forestry was historically the biggest employer, and forestry activities on private lands are still very present in the Adirondacks, but the forestry industry, like many others, today employs far, far, far fewer people than it did 100 years ago, because technology has replaced many of those jobs. There is farming. I'll show you where Lake Champlain is in a moment. In the Eastern Valley, near Lake Champlain, there's quite a bit of farming still, and there's farming in the western part of the park. But for the most part, soils were too thin, winters were too long for agriculture to really be robust in the Adirondacks. It was always an area that was fairly low in terms of agricultural productivity. Okay. Some of the terrain is really rough. This is a shot in what is known as the high peaks of the Adirondacks. This shot kind of gives us three of the great characteristics of the Adirondack landscape: lots of forest land, lots of mountains, and lots of lakes. If you go around the world, there are very few places, and the Adirondacks is one of those places, where there is a large number of mountains and a large number of lakes. There are lots of places with lots of mountains. There are lots of places with lots of lakes. There are very few places that have a proliferation of both lakes and mountains. With all that as background, we come to two regional plans adopted by the state of New York in the early 1970s. So these are the two regional plans. You're going to see these slides a number of times. They were adopted pursuant to the Adirondack Park Agency Act, which was initially passed by the state legislature in 1971. I arrived at the headquarters of the Adirondack Park Agency as a member of its original staff on August 1st of 1972. These are two enormous scale regional plans, 6 million acres and the land comprehensively managed. Why did this happen in the 1970s? Well, that's a long story with many pieces. I will give you just two of them. One is New York State at that time was led by an immensely powerful, bright governor, a man named Nelson Rockefeller, who was determined to do a number of very big things and did a number of very big things. The New York State's university system is entirely due to Nelson Rockefeller's determination that New York State would have a major university system. One of the things he was deeply interested in was protecting the Adirondack Park for the future. And so very strong state leadership was one factor. The other factor is more interesting. At that time, across the United States, numerous states were talking about, and some states acted, at the state level to manage land resources. The environmental movement was growing. The nation's attention to environmental issues was rapidly escalating, and people in state government realized we've got to do a better job managing land resources. And so a number of states, including, but not limited to, including Vermont, California, Florida, New Jersey, Hawaii, and obviously New York State, took very large steps at the state level in terms of managing land resources. So there was a lot going on regarding land in the United States. And at that time, there was a serious discussion in Washington of a major federal land use bill. That discussion ended when Richard Nixon resigned from office. The Nixon administration had been deeply interested in national land use legislation, and that interest in national land use legislation has never resurfaced in the 50 years since. Again, two plans. Whoop. Let's talk a bit about authority. How does the state government control the use of land? Well, I didn't say before, what you're seeing in color is state land. The gray stuff is private land. The state and public lands, as you can see here, are substantially intermingled. And the state lands are classified, although you can't see most of the small classifications. I'll talk about the classifications. But how does the state control land use? Well, regarding state lands, they own it, all right? And because they own it, except given constitutional restraints, they can do what they want to protect the land resources. My color perception is not great. I would call the pale green and aquamarine green. The aquamarine green are state wilderness areas in the Adirondacks where human recreational use is allowed, but it's allowed at a very low level, hiking, camping, et cetera. The state can decide, in order to protect fragile resources, nobody can go into it under the state officials. There are a number of places in national parks the public is not permitted to go into because the federal government is trying to preserve very, very fragile resources. What are the constitutional limits? Well, you can limit access into wilderness areas, but you can't say Catholics and Presbyterians can't hike in wilderness areas. That would be a violation both of the federal Constitution and the state Constitution. But absent constitutional limits, the state basically decides what it wants to do or not do with the lands that it owns. Private land's a bit more complicated. And again, the two regional plans are merged here together. What you just saw on the previous slide, the bright blue are the wilderness areas. The pale green is the other big state type of area. I'll talk about those more. Again, the state has very, very broad powers, subject to constitutional limitations. That power is what we know is known as the police power, which I would assume some of you have heard about in various classes. The police power is an enormously broad, sweeping power, the authority of the sovereign, in this case the state governments, to do whatever is necessary to protect the public's health, safety, morals, and general welfare. It's a power that grows and contracts as society's needs contract. What we do with the police power today is quite a bit different than we were doing with the police power 100 years ago. 100 years ago, it was legal under the police power to bring your horse into a city and tie your horse up outside of the hotel. It is illegal in most cities in America today to bring your horse into the city and tie it up in front of a hotel. So the police power, vast sweeping power, do whatever is necessary to protect public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. An American state's police power comes from all of its citizens, not from the citizens of a particular community, and it does not come to the state from the federal government. So New York State's police power does not come to New York State from the people of New York City, or the people of Ithaca, or the people of Rochester or Buffalo. It comes from the people of the entire state. California's police power does not come to California state government from the people of Los Angeles or the people of San Francisco. It comes from all of the people in the state of California. And as you see in the parentheses, the United States government does not have the general police power. You ought to think about what that means in general context. Most national governments around the world hold the police power. The government of Britain, the government of France, the government of Brazil, the government of Mexico, the government of China, the government of Russia, they all hold the police power and then delegate it downwards to protect public health, safety, morals, and welfare. The United States government does not hold the general police power, which makes the United States government different in a number of ways than most other governments, national governments around the world. There are many, many, many thousands of examples of the police power in action. Building codes, look around this room, it's exercise. There are controls on the electrical systems in terms of what standards they have to meet. The steps have to be a certain minimum width. The steps can't be more than a certain steepness. The doorways have to be a minimum width. There have to be doorways that close in order to have fire control. There are certain things you can't put in the walls because they burn too much. All of those are police power controls, all right? Zoning controls, land use controls, standards on foods and beverages sold in the marketplace, traffic controls, criminal statutes that define criminal activity. Many of you are going to be professionals and have to take a state licensing test. Planners, architects, lawyers, plumbers, electricians. Those are all state police power controls. Cleanliness in restaurants, administration of hospitals, operation of financial institutions. The list goes on and on and on. State government exercise of the police power, again, is this vast sweeping power. Regulating the use of land is simply one example. And finally, when the government exercises the police power, it does not compensate those of us burdened by the police power. We bear that as citizens. It costs Cornell millions every year to abide by the police power controls in building buildings and putting rooms in the buildings. Cornell doesn't go to the city of Ithaca or the state of New York and say, we'd like a check for the millions we have spent to meet the police power controls, just the way Carol and I, owning a house. If we could sell that house to be a bar, we could sell that house for $3 million. The city of Ithaca will not permit a bar in the house that we own. We don't go to Ithaca and say, we'd like a check between what we can sell it for as a residence and what we can sell it for as a bar. Every individual, every corporation bears the cost of the police power, as long as the police power is exercised within constitutional limits. Okay, what lessons? Well, the lessons break into two broad pieces, institutional lessons and lessons about environmental protection mechanisms. There are hundreds and hundreds of details in these two regional plans, the map, and you're going to see those maps again. I'm only going to emphasize a number of the big points. The specifics of what New York State has done is not what I'm arguing about. I'm arguing we should pay attention to what a state government may do when it decides to seriously deal with land use issues across a regional scale. I will also emphasize these lessons are controversial, particularly the lesson about regulating land at the state level. Regulating land by anyone is controversial. Go to a Board of Zoning Appeals hearing some evening. Regulating land at the state level is immensely controversial. And a critic who has read the history of the 1970s stands up, one of you, and says, wait a minute, Booth. In the 1970s, it was the decade of the environment. That's when most of today's federal system for protecting the environment was put in place. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, legislation dealing with hazardous waste. Most of it came about in the 1970s. Not all of it, obviously, but a great deal of it. And this critic says, nobody in the 1970s was talking about climate change. It wasn't on the radar screen. The environment was on the radar screen, but not climate change. New York State wasn't thinking about what we're doing to the climate. And so this person asked, and it's a good question, why pay any attention to what New York State did in the 1970s in terms of dealing with climate change? And I think the answer is clear. It's clear to me, but it might not be clear to others. When we look forward, and I recognize that when we look forward, we're always looking through a dark curtain. The future is never clear, but I think we can see two things as the climate change crisis escalates. One is, to deal with that crisis, we're going to have to deal with land on a very broad scale because it's a global scale crisis. And dealing with land on a small scale is not going to solve that global crisis. Secondly, in dealing with land, we're going to have to learn an important lesson. We're going to have to allow nature to operate largely without substantial interference across broad landscapes. And those two factors are at the very heart of what New York State has accomplished over the past 50 years, dealing with land use across an enormous region. 9,000 square miles is not as big as New York State, but it's a big region. And allowing nature to operate largely unencumbered by human activity. So, two sets of lessons: institutional choices and choices about protecting the environment. The first lesson is the most important one from my perspective. The state has to assume responsibility for land use and natural resource management across a large region. And it's obviously what New York State did. That's the biggest decision it made in the 1970s. Secondly, the state is going to have to be willing to use the power to regulate private land and to use it aggressively in order to manage resources. In the Adirondacks, there are in fact 3 state agencies that make land use decisions. Local governments also have land use powers, but lying on top of local government powers are the powers of 3 state agencies. The Adirondack Park Agency, created, as I said, by the Adirondack Park Agency Act in 1971, is the leading agency. That's where my career started, working as a staff lawyer. And then in 2007, Governor Spitzer, as you heard, appointed me to the park agency itself. The Department of Environmental Conservation is New York State's largest environmental agency. The Department of Health is another major New York State agency. They regulate land across the entire state, including in the Adirondacks. So in the Adirondacks, there are 3 state agencies with very substantial power over land use: the APA, the DEC, and the Department of Health. Thirdly, guarantee that when land use decision making occurs at the state level, multiple constituencies are heard regarding those decisions. And the park agency reflects that. The park agency is a board. It's not a single commissioner. The head of EPA is a single, I guess it's called the administrator. The U.S. Department of Defense is led by an individual secretary. The head of agriculture is the Secretary of Agriculture. The Department of Environmental Conservation here in New York State is led by a commissioner. The park agency consists of 11 people. 3 of those are state officials. That in addition to running their agency, including the DEC commissioner, they are members of the Adirondack Park Agency. The other 8 members are private citizens. And by law, 5 of those 8 have to be full-time residents of the park inside the park. And by law, 3 have to be residents of New York State outside the park. When I was on the agency, I was one of the 3 out-of-park members. I would guess that no individual is ever completely happy with the regulatory decisions made by the Adirondack Park Agency. I've certainly not been happy with all of them. But multiple voices are heard routinely in the making of those decisions. And the final institutional lesson: when you decide to act quickly. Take a look at a typical zoning amendment in any American community with a zoning ordinance. It is very easy to consume a year to 18 months. All right? It is common to consume 2 to 3 years, and not uncommon to consume 4 or 5 or 6 years. The Adirondack Park Agency was created by state legislation in 1971. Let's see if I can find that map. Oop, I'm going to Raybrook, where the park agency had a tiny little place between Lake Placid and Saranac Lake. The first employee arrived there in September of 1971. By August 1st of 1973, these 2 immense regional plans had been created, they had been discussed, and they were enforced as of August 1st, 1973. So this happened very, very rapidly. Once the state decided to act, it decided it's important to act quickly because the resources were very much at risk. Protecting the environment. On state lands, there are a number of major issues, major points. Again, those are the lands that I showed you. Those are the state lands. The first lesson is protect those state lands immensely powerfully. And New York State has done this. And I keep missing, I'm not real experienced with doing this. This is a provision from the state constitution. The lands of the state now owned or hereafter acquired constituting the forest preserve, as now fixed by law, shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, public or private, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. This is the strongest legal protection of any lands in the United States. Why is it the strongest? Because it's in a constitution. The national parks, the national wilderness areas, they are protected by federal statute. If Congress decides this afternoon they want to repeal the national park system and the president is willing to sign it this evening, the national park system ends. A constitution can be amended, but the process is typically difficult. This language has not been amended since 1895. This was placed in a constitution that was adopted at the end of 1894, took effect in January of 1895. The people of the state have aggressively protected this forever wild mandate. It applies to state lands in the Adirondack region and in the Catskill region. It does not apply in the rest of the state. And so the Catskill region, for those of you not familiar with New York, south of Albany, north of New York City, there's a large region called the Catskills. There are far more state lands in the Adirondacks than there are in the Catskills. But protect land as strongly as possible. There have been some amendments. The Forever Wild Clause ties the state's hands, the language you just heard. That one right there, that bright green area and that bright green area are two large state ski areas that were permitted by state constitutional amendment. There have been a number of amendments. They've been very specific. There was an amendment that permitted the building of the Adirondack Northway, which runs from Albany, eventually to the Canadian border, and then the Canadians connect it to Montreal. That was a specific amendment, but the amendments have been specific. They haven't changed the basic legal mandate to protect these state lands as strongly as possible. Secondly, classify these lands, even though they're protected, classify them in terms of recreational use. That's what we call it the State Land Master Plan. That's what this map is. And so the bright green areas, again, I mentioned two of them. There are many more of them. You can't see at this scale. You can see one there. Many of the smaller ones are campgrounds that are intensive use areas. But the two biggest categories are the pale green, wild forest, and the wilderness system that I referred to previously. The state looked at what is the recreational use limits for these lands, and the wilderness areas are allowed to be used much less intensely than the wild forest areas. The biggest difference is that in wild forest, again, these pale green areas, on a designated trail, one may use a snowmobile. That's the biggest difference. In the wilderness areas, the public is not permitted to use motorized equipment. The third lesson about state lands, I'm going to come back to this map, is protect free-flowing rivers. That means don't allow dams on them. I'll talk more about what that means because they flow obviously across state lands, but also across private lands. And so you're going to see that map again. And finally, in terms of lessons about state lands, when you have a chance, expand the state lands that are strongly protected. And this slide gives you a quick idea. In 1885, when the Forest Preserve was first created, even before it was protected as forever wildlands, the state owned about 681,000 acres in the Adirondacks. By 1950, It had become 2.1 million acres by 1972 when that plan was adopted, 2.3 million acres, and now it's about 2.6 million acres are owned and protected by the Constitution. Now, I should have added, there are some state lands that are not forever wildlands. Obviously, the Adirondack Park Agency headquarters is not forever wild. There's a State Department of Health. There are state police barracks. There are highways. Those are obviously not forever wild. But 99% of the state, and there are a number of prisons. There are a number of large state prisons in the Adirondacks. But the vast, vast, vast majority of state lands are protected by this very, very strong provision. And to give you an idea of, that's one of the parcels. I don't know about the mountain areas, but certainly all the low area. This was owned by a forest company, and the state bought this about 10 years ago. This is one of the marvelous additions to the Forest Preserve. Protecting non-state lands. Classify the lands according to their capacity to withstand human use. Again, the private land plan are the bright colors. Hamlet, moderate intensity, brown. Let me think. That's Lake Placid, that's Saranac Lake, that's Tupper Lake, that's Old Forge. This is Lake George. And then you can see a number of other smaller hamlets scattered. The red and orange, in my eyes, the red and orange blur. They kind of look like each other. As you look, if they blur for you, the orange is about 2/3 of the red. Moderate intensity is about 1/3 of that area, and the low intensity is about 2/3. The two biggest classifications are rural use, the yellow, and resource management. What the agency did was engage in what is called McCargian planning. Ian McCarg was a famous landscape architect who taught for years at the University of Pennsylvania and then practiced. And he wrote one of the seminal books in environmental planning in the United States, Design with Nature. That book had come out a few years before the Park Agency came to existence. The agency took the McCargian method and applied it on an enormous regional scale. We looked at soils, slopes, existing land use patterns, habitat, water resources, lots of factors, creating overlay maps. That's what McCarg did to allow the land to tell us where development was more or less feasible. And we had hundreds and hundreds of these overlay maps. And out of that came these six land use areas. By scale, the yellow is about 1 million acres, and the green is about 1.5 million acres. So most of the land, private lands, are in these two very restrictive categories. Industrial use are these purple areas. That's a big one. That's a big one you can see. There are a number of smaller ones. Those are areas that were heavily committed to industry by the early 70s. Most of them were mines. For a long time, including when I was working up there in the 70s, that was the largest open pit iron mine in the world. This was another iron mine where iron had been mined for a very long time. It always had impurities, and so it wasn't very valuable iron. And then World War II started, and some bright geologist or chemist figured out the impurities are titanium. And if you're manufacturing thousands and thousands of planes, which the United States did during World War II, titanium is a real valuable thing to have. And so that mine in the just south of the high peaks of the Adirondacks got much larger during World War II. But this was a McCargian plan. Let the land tell us where development should and should not occur. Basic idea is put development in places where the resources and or infrastructure can properly support it. And so that's the second principle. If I went back to those 6 principles. Encourage development in areas where the resources and infrastructure can support it, and discourage development in the other areas. And again, What the plan basically does is encourage intensive development in the hamlets, and it seriously discourages intense development in the green areas. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but that's the basic idea. You've seen this map before. Protect free-flowing rivers, which are, again, both on public lands and private lands. There's another statute called the New York State Wild, Scenic, and Recreational Rivers Act. It designates hundreds upon hundreds of miles of river segments across the state that have to remain free of dams. The vast majority of those rivers are in the Adirondacks. The other big group of them, not nearly as big as this group, is on Long Island. They're actually a number of, and I forgot to mention, Fall Creek is a recreational river under this statute. Obviously, there's a dam there, but it's illegal to put another dam on Fall Creek. It's illegal under state law. It is not illegal under federal law to put another dam, but it's illegal under state law. Focus on regulating the density of environment, and this is perhaps the most controversial aspect. The state severely regulates density in large parts of the park. There are no density restrictions in either hamlet, the brown, or industrial use. That makes sense. Again, the state's trying to encourage development in the hamlets, and in industrial use, they were already committed to very, very intense use. But the other four areas, moderate intensity, low intensity, rural use, resource management, there are declining levels of development allowable. The restrictions are stated in terms of principal buildings. That's a defined term, but think of an individual store or think of an individual house as a principal building. It's a much more complicated definition. 500 principal buildings per square mile in moderate intensity, down to 15 in resource management. What you see here, the statute doesn't say this, but this is, if you divided those into average lot sizes, that's what they are. So 42.7 acres for a single home in resource management. They are not intended to be lot sizes. They are intended to put development where development is most supportable and to leave the rest of the land undeveloped. The development restrictions are applied against each landowner. So if I own 100 acres in resource, I need to keep the math simple. Booth is not one of your math geniuses. If I own 100 acres in resource management, I get to build maybe, if I have to go through a permit process, as you'll hear, 2 or 3 houses, all right? And rather than divide that up into 40-acre lots, what I probably should do from an environmental point of view is put the houses on half-acre or 1-acre lots and leave most of the land open for resource management, forestry activities, farming, et cetera. And again, that's the concept that the state decided to focus on. The application of the overall intensity guidelines is a complicated set of rules. It's a sliding scale. The state has much greater interest in protecting resources in rural use and resource management than in the more intensely developed parts of the park, and the sliding scale reflects that. If you want to find one grab line that will make people in the Adirondacks angry, it's that 42.7 acres per building in resource management. That has been the single most controversial aspect, and one wouldn't be surprised at that. A fifth lesson, let me see if I can find the map there. The map, all right, lot in the 6 million acres. Some of it is much more sensitive than others, what I would call sensitive environmental areas. There are special controls on sensitive environmental areas in a variety of ways. There are shoreline restrictions that apply to every shoreline in the Adirondacks. They set setback requirements for buildings, setback requirements for on-site sewage. They set cutting restrictions for vegetation along lake shores. There are the river corridors, if I can find those again. Nope, I went the wrong way. The river corridors, there are special regulations that apply to a half-mile wide corridor, 1/4 mile on each side. Not the red ones. The red ones are rivers that are still being studied for possible inclusion. But the others, there's a half-mile wide corridor that's subject to special regulations to limit development near these protected rivers. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of wetlands. Virtually all development in wetlands is regulated by the state. And so I'm going to talk about the project system, but if I have a wetland lot there's wetland on my lot in Hamlet, even though the state's trying to encourage development, that's intensely regulated because a wetland is considered a critical environmental area wherever it is located. Other critical environmental areas include high elevations. That's a particularly sensitive area in New York State above 2,500 feet. Certain highway corridors that are in the remote parts of the park are considered critical environmental areas because they help maintain the scenic quality of the Adirondacks. And wherever you see the bright blue wilderness areas, and then there's a pale blue that's on there that's a little hard. There are a number of primitive areas. They're almost wilderness. If you own land within a quarter mile of those special state land areas, those are also regulated as critical environmental areas. And finally, the agency is a regulatory agency. In fact, much of what I did once this plan went into effect is I became the lawyer for, there were only two of us that were lawyers. My boss was the general counsel. I became responsible for overseeing the regulatory system. Well, not overseeing it, but making sure the permits contained all the right language. The statute sets up a very comprehensive system of regional projects. There are many more regional projects in resource management than in Hamlet. That's understandable. The state has a greater interest in protecting the resource management areas. In a hamlet, a 99-unit residential subdivision does not require a permit under this statute. A 100-unit subdivision in a hamlet does. In a resource management area, a single-family home requires a regional permit. So again, it's a sliding scale, with the state's interest greater in certain places. And in critical environmental areas, virtually everything's regulated. So as I said, if you have a wetland in a hamlet area, you're regulated. If you're on non-wetland land in a hamlet area, the chances are you can build without being regulated by the state of New York. Two big exceptions to the permit system. Almost all agricultural activities are exempt from regulation. The state leaders decided that agricultural activities served, Lake Champlain's that big body of water on the east, Vermont's to the east of Lake Champlain. Most of the agricultural land in the Adirondacks is located in the Champlain Valley. The state decided that regulating agriculture under this statute wasn't something the state wanted to do. The other big exemption is that most forest management activities are not regulated under the statute. Environmentalists have always been somewhat concerned about that. Large-scale clear-cutting of forests is regulated, but large-scale clear-cutting hasn't occurred in the Adirondacks for the most part in the last 125 years. All right? Most large-scale clear-cutting ended in the Adirondacks by the early 20th century. How am I doing, Jeff? I'm okay? Okay, I've run through a bunch of lessons. Again, there are hundreds of details. These are two big, complex plans. It perhaps gives you a sense of what one has to know to work with all of this. Nothing New York State has done in the Adirondacks came easily. None of it. All right? This is a half century of effort, but nothing happened easily. This was immensely controversial in the Adirondacks. In the 1970s, there was a very common phrase that you heard, "Don't tell me we live in a park." All right? It is a park. It's been defined as a park since the 1800s. All right? But many Adirondackers, that's where they live. That's where they work. That's where the kids go to school. That's where they're buried in cemetery, or their parents are buried. They're not buried there yet. All right? And so this was controversial then. It's controversial now. None of the mechanisms I've talked about have been problem-free. All right? They haven't worked perfectly. We did this plan quickly, all right, and put it in place. And so it can't be surprising that not everything has worked perfectly. Scientists cannot prove today that what we've done in the Adirondacks reduces climate change at all. But looking forward, as I said earlier, we can expect we're going to have to deal with land on a large basis, and we're going to have to allow nature to operate across large landscapes without substantial human interference. And this has worked pretty well over 50 years. Despite lots of controversy and any number of problems, this has worked pretty well. Therefore, some overarching lessons that maybe can be applied elsewhere. Assign primary land use decision-making to the state government in order to protect and manage land resources across an important region. Very stringently protect, and I'll put the map, very stringently protect public lands in the region that are held for conservation purposes, and where appropriate, increase the acreage of those conservation lands. Thirdly, maintain as much forest cover as possible on the region's public and private lands. Certainly the state of New York has done that. Fourthly, protect the free-flowing character of as many rivers as possible in the region on both public and private lands. Permit significant new development on the region's private lands in only those places where resources and existing infrastructure or new or appropriately expanded infrastructure can reasonably support intense human activity. Substantially limit new development activity on the region's private lands that are remote from already established community centers, and for the large part, the resource management areas are generally quite a ways from the hamlet centers. And finally, number 7, severely limit new development activity on the region's private lands wherever land resources are especially fragile, including but not limited to shorelines, wetlands, and other areas of special environmental concern. That's a very famous scene south of Lake Placid looking toward the high peaks. The Adirondack loon lives not only in the Adirondacks, but it's a very characteristic species. This is a huge, largely wild, immensely robust, from a natural point of view, park. Existing in the country's 4th most populous state. And when the state of New York did this in the 1970s, it was the 2nd most populous state. Only California was larger when the state did this. It is a huge natural area within a day's drive of tens and tens of millions of Americans. All right? Upstate New York's not that far from a whole lot of places in the eastern United States, and it's within an easy day's drive of millions of Canadians. It was important in the 1970s to protect this huge landscape. Nelson Rockefeller recognized that and made sure it happened, and he did it over strong opposition from his own party. In the 1970s, the American population was 213 million. It was important to do this. It's far more important to protect this type of landscape now. The United States population has grown by more than 50%. Today it's 327 million, and it's far more important that we have protected landscapes in a much busier, much more technologically driven world than we did in the 1970s. Coming back to that slide, New York State has managed land resources in the Adirondacks for more than 50 years. And with regard to the state lands, they've obviously protected them for a much longer period than that. What you have heard could not have been accomplished. I want to emphasize that, local government by local government. Local governments in New York State would not have done anything like this in a 50-year period or a 100-year period. This was not doable except at the state level. So, that list of overarching principles, one more at the bottom. If a state decides to act to protect the land and water resources of an important region, take bold, aggressive steps. And that's a political message. And New York State was willing to do that. The leaders were willing to do that. And this is what has happened. One last slide. That's not me, although I certainly wish it were. And when I was younger, I did quite a bit of that. Not sure my knees would do well in a canoe now. William Chapman White wrote Adirondack Country in 1954. And what I'm about to read to you is the single, and you'll see it at the bottom of the slide, the single most famous paragraph ever written about the Adirondacks. As a man tramps the woods to the lake, he knows he will find pines and lilies, blue herons and golden shiners, shadows on the rocks, and the glint of light on the wavelets, just as they were in the summer of 1354, as they will be in 2054 and beyond. He can stand on a rock by the shore and be in a past he could not have known and a future he will never see. He can be part of time that was and time yet to come. And having read Adirondack Country, I'm pretty sure William Chapman White was intending to include the she's in that comment. Thank you for listening. I hope there are some questions.
Thank you very much. That talk comes from recently published, spring 2025, Tulane Environmental Law Journal copy. So it's a pleasure to have it in print for a wide audience as well as for us today. So questions now, and of course there will be a talk back at 2 in room 105 afterwards as well.
Hi, Professor. I'm Di Zhang, a first-year MRP student, and I want to ask you a question. We understand that approximately 44% of this park is publicly owned by the people of New York State and protected under the state's constitution as forever wild. So this achievement is highly instructive, and I want to learn something about the process behind this constitutional protection. Was its implementation the result of a lengthy and challenging effort of advocacy and perseverance?
Well, there's a lot in that question. First of all, the forever, and many people who come to the Adirondacks have heard the term forever wild and they think it applies to the whole park. It applies only to state lands. And the rest of the park is not forever wild. It's privately owned. And under the state and federal constitutions, a landowner has to be allowed a reasonable economic use of their property. You might say, how is 42 acres per house reasonable economic use? Because most of that land is highly valuable for forest lands. In terms of process, this is still a sore point in the Adirondacks. As I said to you, this happened quickly, all right? The legislation required the park agency coming into existence in September of 1971 to complete these 2 land use plans by January 1st of 1973. That's the honest to God truth. We got to November of 1972 and sent word to Albany, the governor, the legislative, we're not done. We need another year. And the word came back from Albany, be very clear. In 1973, the New York State Legislature will adopt Adirondack legislation. Either they will adopt what you propose in the Adirondacks where you know something about it, or we will do it in Albany on a desktop, but it will be done. They gave us 2 extra months. We didn't quite meet that deadline. We sent the plan to the legislature and the governor on March 6th, accompanied by an armed state policeman, because there was a lot of reaction to what was going on, all right? And it was adopted by the legislature after a considerable debate and went in May, and then went into effect in August. I'm not sure that got to all of what you asked, but that's part of the process. In the Adirondacks today, you will still hear people say, you did it too quickly. As I said to you before, I think that's one of the lessons. If you're going to act, you better do it quickly. Otherwise, the discussion will go on for years. And had it gone on for years, one of the things I didn't talk about is in the early 70s, there were a number of projects proposed. Big pieces of forest land were going into the hands of developers. They wanted to build 10, 15,000 homes in parts of the Adirondacks. And some of that development occurred, but most of it did not. Did that help? Good, thank you.
Oh, I thought you gave it to her.
You've got the microphone.
Hi. Sorry, right here in the
Yes.
front. My name is Sophia Caparuso.
Oh, there you are, I'm sorry. Yeah,
So
you're
I've
right
lost
in
my-
front of it.
No worries. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate studying environmental policy and governance, and I may have misinterpreted, but from what I heard, you spoke about there being exemptions for people with certain religious beliefs who are allowed to go into the classified wilderness
No.
areas.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
What I said is, in managing state land, state governments have very broad powers to decide what to allow and what not to allow, but they're bound by the Constitution. What they cannot do is say, we want to protect wilderness areas, and to do so, we're going to not allow Presbyterians and Catholics. That obviously would be
Okay.
unconstitutional.
I see.
That's simply an example. There are lots of
Got it.
other things that would be unconstitutional.
Got it.
Does that help?
That does help, yeah. A separate question about land use in terms of like a strategy where you minimize human use of the land and impact as much as possible. Would this to you also mean like potential positive impacts like a rewilding strategy or like for instance, certain indigenous peoples have practices that use land less
Well,
intensively. Would that also be
The
considered?
Adirondacks today, because of what's happened, are far wilder than they were 50 years ago. All right, because nature has been allowed basically to, I mean, it's not rewilding because most of the Adirondacks never got heavily developed. But for example, what was the big threat to the landscape in the late 1800s? Anybody tell me? It wasn't agriculture. What was the big threat? Fire. Caused by what? Logging companies would simply cut everything they could, leave all the branches because they couldn't haul the branches out. And so, and the trains were, railroads run through the Adirondacks. And so big forest fires. The Adirondacks forests are now far more mature than they were 100 years ago. Right. And presumably they'll be more mature 100 years from now.
Thank you.
Did that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, Julian Hartman, postdoc. I want to ask a clarifying question about the relationship between the state lands and private lands that are regulated by the state. So you mentioned that the Forever Wild Clause, you said, was adopted in 1895, is that right? And so then the 1970s...
Forever Wild Clause in the state constitution went into effect with a constitution that took effect on January 1st of 1895.
Right. And so then what happened in the 70s was regulating the private lands. Is that...
That was the big decision.
Okay.
But you've touched on a sensitive point in the New York State government. By the 1970s, the old Conservation Department had become the new Department of Environmental Conservation. They had not done a terribly good job in protecting the state lands. They had allowed a lot of roads to be built, even though they were forever wild. And so in large part, the State Land Master Plan was a reaction saying, yes, the state lands are protected, but they haven't been protected enough. The private lands were, you're absolutely right, the big step. But the State Land Plan was still a very important step because DEC, or the predecessor Conservation Department, there was no idea in the conservation of wilderness areas. You didn't do that. All right, so it was a big step. That remains a sore spot between the two agencies. I mean, agencies are proud, right? They have their own agendas. And one of the ongoing conflicts in the Adirondacks is tension between the Adirondack Park Agency and the DEC, even though the DEC commissioner sits on the park agency. I used to teach a course in environmental politics. If you ever think that government agencies don't argue with each other, you have missed most of the drama. Government agencies see other government agencies as their rivals. Rivals for money, rivals for people, and the fight between, it's what I call turf. turf fights between agencies are legendary at state level, federal level. The conflicts in Washington between the Marines, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army are so deep and so long, and it's part of Washington's background, and that's true in government generally. And so DEC and the Park Agency, they're not at loggerheads, but it's also not been a smooth relationship.
Okay, so there was like a deepening of enforcement or the interpretation of what forever wild means in the 70s.
That's correct. You and I can have a much longer discussion. There are certain things about forever wild that have not been answered and probably are not going to be answered. I mentioned campgrounds. The campgrounds on state lands are probably unconstitutional. This is somebody who's been involved in this for a long time.
Okay.
The reason I say it's not going to get resolved, because if it were to be resolved that they're unconstitutional, Article 14 would get amended. And so the environmental community has decided it's better to live with the campgrounds than force an answer to that in court.
Okay, so as a follow-up to the first question that was asked, do you know anything about the background to the constitutional amendment in 1895? Is there a story behind that
yes,
as well?
What was
Thanks.
yes, and I missed that. Yes, thank you. A number of things were going on in the 1890s. One was preserving water, all right? The Adirondacks are the headwaters of a number of major rivers. And because a lot of the forests had been either cut down or burned, there was very deep concern about water resources. And so that was perhaps the biggest concern. Another concern was a number of these green areas by then were owned by very wealthy people. And they wanted state lands near their lands protected. That's owned by a Rockefeller, all right? That's a resource management, heavily restricted. But some of those biggest states, some of the wealthy people with deep connections in Albany wanted the lands protected. For those of you who now are, all of you are at Cornell, the State Forestry School used to be here at Furneaux Hall. Furneaux was one of the early forest leaders at the national level. State Forestry School was here. Dr. Furneaux got involved in managing a piece of land in the Adirondacks, and he angered a number of very powerful, wealthy people who owned estates in the Adirondacks. The state of New York took the forestry school away from Cornell and put it where? At Syracuse, and it never came back. All right, so my point is there are many, you don't want to get me talking about the Adirondacks too much, because there are layers and layers of wonderful stories, but thank you. Anything else?
Hi there. Thank you so much. My name is Della Alderson. I'm a second-year MRP, and I have a couple of questions. I have worked and studied in Nova Scotia, Canada, where we're facing kind of similar issues as the Adirondacks were 50 years ago. It's a former logging province.
Resource extraction.
Yes,
right,
and
right.
it's now much more uranium mining focused, of whether it's going to come back or not. And so we do currently and have consistently lacked the strong government at the provincial level, which would be equivalent to state. And so I was wondering if you have any recommendations on how to act when you don't have that.
Elect different people. Look at, I said we had a strong governor. This happened in 1971, 1972, 1973. Anybody remember? Michael might. What happened at the end of 1973? Nelson Rockefeller resigned as governor because he wanted to become president. He had taken a number of runs at the presidency. He wanted to make one more. He never obviously got there. He was vice president under Gerald Ford, but not president. This could not have happened without him. There has not been a single legislative session in Albany since 1973 when this could have happened. So, I mean, that's part of the lesson. You need strong leadership, and the state had it at that time. But folks, if we're talking about a crisis, you think people are going to be willing to think about, we've got to act in a different way than we've acted up until now. And so, yes, this is difficult. Dealing with state land use issues is a controversial topic that most state legislators do not want to talk about, all right? I mentioned that in the early 1970s, a number of states acted. How many have taken big steps since the 1970s? Very few. Land use issues largely disappeared for the national environmental discussion for a variety of reasons. All right, this is something that happened before they disappeared from the agenda. But that's a good question. I've traveled many times in Canada. Love it. I grew up in Plattsburgh, just right near the. Love Canada, but I would not give advice to the provinces of Canada.
Fair enough. Thank you.
I got it, another mic. Good afternoon, good to see you again. Braden Stillwell, I am a first-year MRP. I know you said you kind of wanted to keep the discussion on state law, but I was a little curious about, you mentioned that Nixon, he was interested in national land use, but after he got impeached, the discussion never really went anywhere after that.
Right.
And so do you think that this is something that will come up in the future? And if so, what would that look like pertaining to New York State? And if you want to take it more broad, you can, but specifically to New York State.
I think if it were going to come up again, it probably would have. It's been 50 years since Richard Nixon. It wasn't Nixon particularly. It were people on his staff were very interested in land use. A man named John Ehrlichman, whom the older people will remember that name. John Ehrlichman was an environmental land use lawyer from either Portland or Seattle, and he was deeply interested in land use issues. Well, John Ehrlichman's one of the guys that went to prison as a result of Watergate. All right, I mean Watergate. Apparently that's why Nixon gave up his support. He had support, but he traded support in the Senate because he didn't want to get impeached. And the National Land Use Bill died at that point, and then he resigned anyway. But what it would look like, I don't know. I mean, we're 50 years later, but we've got to start thinking about land use issues, as I've argued, on a much larger scale than we have thought about them. And remember what I said at the beginning, the United States government does not have the general police power. They have other substantial powers, but there'd be a very interesting decision if the United States government decided to try to regulate land on a large scale. State governments have huge power if they choose to use it.
Sorry, I've got the mic. Thank you so much, Professor Booth. So I'm in the law school. I'm the Environmental Law Society co-president. I think I'm the only one from the law school here. So
good.
You made me so hopeful as someone who's taking administrative law right now and just learning about how the rules are being broken. And so I'm so hopeful right now. I do want to contest one point that you made, but you're going to love this.
Well, there has been one. I'm lucky.
There has been a proven like positive climate impact because of land use. In Notre Dame Law Review's journal, they talk about a renewable energy pledge in San Diego, which lowered emissions. And I was lucky to be there when that happened. That's where I went to undergrad, and we had the lowest carbon emissions in America, actually. So I know all about it. And yeah, but one thing that we did is we would install like triple pane windows to lower power bills, and that's something everyone could get behind because it meant lower power bills. And so my question is, like, would that fall within the state police power? Like, can a state tell people to use?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Exactly.
Look,
Right.
if you look at the plumbing code or the electricity code, they're much more detailed than requiring triple pane windows. All right, absolutely, police power covers that.
And then,
Now, whether the state's willing to do that, that's another question.
and that leads to my second question, and you got around to it on your own through your presentation, but this all just sounds too good to be true. Like, I'm used to dooming in the law school, you're learning about what's going on in the federal level. So, like, do you have any other like major drawbacks or challenges that come with this strategy for climate action that you can think of?
Those who know me, you know I'll make it going. I will simply say this. I've been interested in the climate crisis for a long time. And I've said, when I was sitting on the park agency, I used to say this in public meetings. I don't think there's a serious discussion at the federal or state level regarding climate change, and I don't think it depends on whether they're Republicans or Democrats in office. There is no serious attention in this country to the price of energy. When I was a senior in high school, Plattsburgh, New York is right there, right? Just outside the park. Gasoline was selling for 31 cents a gallon when I was a senior in high school. If you calculate in the inflation rate over 60 years, that's more than 60 years ago, gasoline now is selling for about 31 cents a gallon in 1961. What does that tell you? Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, they disagree on 1,000 issues. They have agreed almost unanimously on the price of energy. Keep it as low as possible, keep it as low as possible for as many Americans as possible, keep it as low as possible for as long as possible. And we have done that. And until the price of energy starts changing, folks, we're not going to make a whole lot of progress confronting climate change. And I've said that many times. The Europeans, the price of gas has been far higher. They're driving way too much. Right? If you think the Europeans have solved the climate crisis because they're paying $6 for gasoline or $8, whatever. I was in Poland about 10 years ago. They were paying $9 a gallon for gasoline. They measure it in liters, but you know, Booth with his limited math. Kieran's got serious math abilities, but not Booth. It was about $9 a gallon. The Europeans, that price isn't going to solve the energy crisis. So, I don't know if that helps, but.
Joe said you bring a lot of life. It's so true. I wish you were at our law school. Thank you.
Well, I've spoken at the law school at various times. Is there anything else?
Sure. So,
Yeah, Mildred, yeah.
Professor Booth, you have argued, as many planners do, that planners can do it right and that higher levels of government can do it better than lower levels of government. But that assumes that we get it right. And so I'm thinking about the fracking revolution, where it was local land use planning boards that decided to slow down that process in New York because they were concerned that there might be implications for water, which it turns out there were. And then I'm thinking of the current major solar transition, utility scale solar, where the state changed the law to make sure that local land use and planning boards would not be able to slow down the solar transition the way they slowed the fracking transition. And in the decisions that are being made by the state, there's less transparency than we traditionally see in local decisions. And there's some areas where they're not thinking about, like wildlife corridors or water, how water's going to flow. So I just want to question your enthusiasm for the knowledge, especially on new things, and the vesting all the power at the state level. I just want you to think about that a little bit, because we have this incredible difference of all these 2,100 places that get to have land use power, and then here's a place where they didn't, and we have two new transitions happening, fracking and solar, which are now places where they don't.
Wonderful questions. I don't believe I ever said, and if I did, I correct myself now, that I believe state governments make all the right decisions, all right? I was a state official. I was a local official for a long time. I'm well aware the state of New York can make mistakes. I also will add, I said this quickly, but I didn't want to, because it's complicated. Local governments in the Adirondacks they retain their land use powers. What the state did was lay all of this on top of local decision making. What that means is a landowner has to comply with both local controls and state controls. But with only one exception, local governments have all the land use powers that they have in Ithaca or New York City, et cetera. The one exception is if they have shoreline restrictions, they cannot be less restrictive than the park agency statute. That's the only inroad on local authority. But look at, you're absolutely right. There's nothing that makes state level decision making magic. Or federal decision making for that matter. It's just that as I look at the climate change crisis, dealing with land issues, one local government at a time in a state that has 2,100 decision makers, I don't think we're going to make much progress. New York State passed a climate act with a great deal of publicity in 2019. It was signed by Governor Andrew Cuomo, and the state has made very, very little progress in the 6 years since then. And in part, it's because dealing with land use issues at the state level remains very controversial. All right, it was controversial then. This could not have happened politically in the Finger Lakes. All right, it couldn't have happened in the Catskills. There was actually an effort following this in the mid-'70s in the Catskills, and I was part of that. It disappeared when Governor Kerry, at the last moment, broke a deal to pass Catskill legislation, and that legislation has never come back. At the state level. That was kind of a remarkable story in and of itself. You're absolutely right. There's nothing that guarantees anybody's going to make the right choices. But I think in terms of land, we better start thinking on a much broader basis than we've been. That's what I'm trying to argue.
So, hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was great. My name is Alejandra. I'm a research support specialist. I work in the Climate Justice Institute here at Cornell. And, well, I have two questions, and I think you kind of like resolved those with the previous one. So the first one, I don't know. I wonder if we could do more like a fast-track process for maybe decisions around climate change. I know that might be sound weird, but I wonder if we could like try to do what you did back then. Right now, I think taking decisions is so hard, and we don't have time. So I don't know if we can
I think there are some areas where fast-track decision-making makes a lot of sense. And so
Yeah.
there are probably some energy facilities we should think about putting on a fast track. But, you know, again, these are big, complicated areas. In response to that, and in part response to Mildred, I was taught in a planning program for 45 years, and the big emphasis is kind of ground up planning, and I understand that. But in my experience, I was part of 3 very clearly top-down efforts. All right? This one,
Yeah.
and there's no question, the state of New York overrode the sentiment of the Adirondacks. All right? Had this been put to a vote in the Adirondacks in the 1970s, we'd have lost 10-1. All right? Today, we would lose 6-1. All right? Those of us who support what the state has done. The second big top-down effort was to protect tidal wetlands. Tidal wetlands, the state of New York actually went further than, not freshwater wetlands, tidal wetlands. Think of Long Island, think of the Hudson River estuary. Those are tidal wetlands. The state simply imposed land use regulations, and local governments are not permitted to do anything that violates those regulations. And then the third effort was, I was a lawyer at DEC. New York City has big water reservoirs in the Catskills. This wasn't regulating how much water they take out of the Catskills. This was regulating how they let water out of the reservoirs into the downstream areas. And they were doing it in a way that damaged the environment. Yep. New York City is a big political opponent. They were ferociously opposed to the state of New York imposing limitations on how they disposed of water from their reservoirs. Nevertheless, the governor signed legislation, and we at DEC adopted regulations governing the city of New York. They were clearly top-down. Now, so I guess the answer is, in some cases, bottom-up planning matters. The problem with climate change is so many different entities get to make choices about land use.
Yeah, I agree.
Your second question.
My second question, I understand why you're saying about like we have to think about like the use of the land in a bigger scale. I have a background in biology, and I totally agree with you. But I'm kind of like right now with the political environment that we are living in, it's kind of scary to give more power to those that might not agree with climate change politics. So,
well, my answer as a lawyer would be the power is already there.
okay.
The state may choose not to exercise the power, but they have the power. Every state in the United States has power to do this if they choose to exercise the power. The police power is held by the state governments. It is an immensely powerful power.
Yeah,
right?
I'm sorry, I'm not from the state, so
it's
that's
okay.
why
So
it's scary.
The question is whether a state government's willing to use power that it has.
Okay,
Most of them have not been willing to use it.
okay, thank
New
you.
York State, in this case, was.
I wanted to make a quick comment. The last presentation we heard was from Jamie Bouchard, who's now with the
Department of State.
Department of State. And she was talking about trying to make bridges between the different agencies, Shoreline and other things that work with her. And so I think it's interesting talking about her looking as she sort of begins that role, thinking of her optimism about making change and contrasting it with someone who spent a little bit of time in those trenches, it's a sort of a reality check, but at the same time, it shows the importance of what she's trying to accomplish there.
Well, look at it. Again, as I used to say to my environmental politics class, if you believe government is basically uniform and not arguing with each other, you've missed much of the drama. Right? Because government typically is arguing endlessly, state versus federal, state versus local, federal agencies against each other. When we dealt with New York City's water reservoirs, when I was at DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Delaware, the state of New Jersey, those three states consider New York State and New York City the evil empire on earth when it comes to water. Why? I mean, when we were doing those regulations, the regulators, environmental officials in Pennsylvania were so angry with the state of New York, they almost wouldn't talk to us. Why are they angry? Because New York City is permitted. The Delaware River doesn't, it's not on here. Delaware, oh, I'm going the wrong way, Booth. Go back to that map of all of New York State. All the way back. Delaware River doesn't run anywhere near New York City. New York City is permitted by a decree of the United States Supreme Court to take 800 million gallons of water a day out of the Delaware River and deliver it to the people of the city of New York to drink. New York City has probably the best water of any big city in the world, all right? Probably without exception. The anger in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware toward New York because of that is a century deep, all right? And it's not going to go away. Now, obviously, they interact on lots of issues. Don't get me wrong. But government typically argues with other government entities. I've concluded in my long career it's an aspect of governmental DNA. It's built into them. If my agency gets more money, more responsibility, that's good. If your agency gets more money and that's bad, all right? And that drives an awful lot of government. I'm not naive about the conflicts in government. I'm trying to get people to start thinking about land on a broader scale if we're going to face something as big as climate change. And this is partly, we didn't make all the right decisions. We didn't see some of the questions in 1973. We had to act under a very strict time clock. And so did we not see certain things? Yeah, we didn't see certain things. All right? And the legislature has not been willing to repair a number of those things in the 50 years since.
Can you show them the Delaware River? Because a lot of the
I can't.
Can you show them the Delaware River?
Oh, I'll try. The Delaware River rises in the Catskills, basically flows west, and then forms the border with Pennsylvania before it turns south and forms the border between New Jersey and Delaware, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and then flows into Delaware. Yeah, I'm sorry, yes. And so it starts here, goes west, and then comes down here, and then flows south. The Supreme Court of the United States, a litigation that started over a century ago. Why did it start? Because Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware recognized New York City is going to glom onto all this water, and that's going to threaten our interests. And so they brought litigation against the state of New York, or at least one of them started, the other two then joined. The Supreme Court in the 1930s awarded New York City a certain number of hundreds of millions of gallons, and later that was increased to 800 million gallons a day.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, thank you so much for such an amazing and informative presentation. My name is Manon. I'm a third-year Bachelor of Architecture student, and I'm just curious what role other departments, such as like architecture or non-policy-based departments, can kind of play in, I guess, like promoting these efforts. Yeah, yeah, pretty much like what can other people do that maybe isn't necessarily policy based can do to push for more, for stronger efforts?
Any big policy requires input, and this was reflected, I think, very well in Mildred's question. It can't be just planners. It can't. If you ask the lawyers will tell you it's just us. It can't be. It has to be the biologists, the physicists, et cetera. And so, particularly in something dealing as large as land, there's lots of contributions that can be made by many kinds of professionals. And the young woman who spoke, well, who's our former student last week, I asked her about this later. One of the big problems in any environmental policy area is the professionals. Obviously, talking to the public is always difficult because the professionals quite often leave the public behind. They're so involved in the details. But another layer of problems is most professionals don't talk well to each other. The lawyers have a language, they talk well. The engineers talk well. The planners talk, but they don't easily talk across those lines. Years ago, a young woman graduated from our undergraduate program. My brain isn't as quick as it was. I'm coming back. And then she stayed and got a master's degree. And she went to work for a big engineering consulting firm. These are the firms that do a lot of the advising, environmental impact statements, advising of local governments when they're changing land use regulations, sewer regulations. They're usually headed by engineers, but they have lots of other types of professionals working for them. She went to work for one of the big firms in New York City, all right? And one of the big projects that firm was working on is the 2nd Avenue subway. Now, are any of you familiar with that term in New York City? The 2nd Avenue subway was being worked on when I was in high school, all right? And that was just a few years ago. It's one of these decades-long projects. And she was sent out with these team of engineers and other specialists, and her mother would kind of say, I sent you to Cornell to wear a hard hat to go, you know. And so anyway, she came back and gave a colloquium talk. 6 months after she started working, they figured out this young woman with a planning degree knows how to talk to other professionals and knows how to talk to the public. We're going to send her by herself to talk at public meetings because she knew enough of the details not to make a serious error, and she knew how to talk to people. Communications, you know, is a big problem. But to get back to your question, the contributions have got to come from a lot of people. At the park agency, there were 2 of us were lawyers, a number were biologists. Some of the most useful people were landscape architects because that regional project system requires looking at projects that are proposed to go on a particular piece of ground. Guess what landscape architects have been talking about? How do you put an activity on the ground without harming the environment, right? And so we had about 20 of us. That's how these plans got done, with about 20 people, including 5 secretaries. This was done very, very quickly, folks. We had a combination of expertise. And the guy with the most expertise was a guy that come to Cornell to do a master's degree and never finished it. But he was one of these people that could see the environment in multiple ways, and he also had charisma. I mean, he could stand in front of an audience and just wow them. And he had read Ian McCarg, and he knew a lot about environmental planning. He turned out to be the most critical person. Never came back to Cornell to finish his degree.
Well, that's a great note for us to end on here. Thank you again, Professor Richard Booth.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.